Lincoln High School falls into stunned silence as U.S. Circuit Court Judge Isaiah Bennett enters with federal marshals, his judicial authority commanding immediate attention, while security footage of Officer Brad Hutchinson's brutal assault against his 15-year-old daughter plays on administrative monitors. Hutchinson's confident authority crumbles as he recognizes the silent black teenager he'd kicked in the hallway just 2 hours earlier. The same girl he'd dismissed as another disrespectful kid who needs to learn her place. "Good afternoon, Officer Hutchinson," Judge Bennett announces, his voice carrying unmistakable federal judicial authority throughout the packed administrative office. "I am Judge Isaiah Bennett, United States Circuit Court of Appeals. Some of you may recognize my daughter Kennedy, the 15-year-old honor student you physically assaulted in the hallway while she was standing quietly at her locker." His eyes lock onto Hutchinson, who has gone pale. "Officer Hutchinson, I believe we need to discuss why you kicked an unarmed teenager who was completely silent and non-threatening, and why you told witnesses that these kids need to be taught respect through whatever force is necessary." The gathered staff freeze in recognition. The officer who 2 hours ago had absolute authority over student discipline now faces the federal judge whose daughter he brutalized, and arrest warrants are already signed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 6 hours earlier, 15-year-old Kennedy Bennett had been preparing for another day at Lincoln High School, her routine shaped by the quiet discipline that had made her honor roll student and model of the respectful behavior her parents had instilled throughout her upbringing. Kennedy's personality reflected her father's judicial temperament, thoughtful, measured, and conflict-averse to the point where teachers often noted her reluctance to speak in class, despite obvious academic excellence and deep understanding of subject material. At 15, Kennedy had inherited her mother's medical precision and her father's analytical thinking, her academic success built on careful preparation rather than natural brilliance or social dominance that characterized more outgoing students. Judge Isaiah Bennett had served on the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals for 8 years, his judicial career spanning 23 years, from prosecutor to district judge to appellate authority, whose decisions affected constitutional law across multiple states. At 51, Bennett's reputation emphasized constitutional protection and civil rights enforcement, his judicial opinions frequently cited for their clarity about equal protection requirements and limitations on government authority over individual rights. His appointment to Circuit Court had been recognition of exceptional legal mind, combined with unwavering commitment to constitutional principles that transcended political ideology to focus on legal reasoning and precedent. Kennedy's mother, Dr. Nicole Bennett, practiced emergency medicine at Riverside Medical Center, her professional experience with violence victims making her acutely aware of trauma affecting youth who experienced abuse from authority figures. The Bennett family had deliberately chosen Lincoln High School, despite its challenges, because they believed in supporting public education, rather than fleeing to private institutions when communities face difficulties. "We want Kennedy to understand real-world challenges rather than being isolated in privilege," Judge Bennett had explained when colleagues questioned the choice. Public schools deserve support from families with resources to demand excellence, but Lincoln High School had been experiencing increasing tensions between students and school resource officers whose aggressive enforcement approach created hostile environment rather than ensuring safety. Officer Brad Hutchinson had been serving as school security officer for 5 years, his tenure marked by escalating complaints about excessive force, discriminatory treatment, and verbal abuse, particularly affecting minority students. Hutchinson's approach to school security reflected military-style discipline rather than educational support. His interactions with students characterized by confrontation and control rather than mentorship or de-escalation. Personnel records documented multiple complaints from students and parents about Hutchinson's aggressive behavior, but administrative responses had been limited to verbal counseling without meaningful discipline or behavioral modification. Principal Robert Daniels had been attempting to balance school safety concerns with community complaints about excessive security presence. His administrative position complicated by district policies emphasizing zero-tolerance enforcement. We need to maintain safe learning environment while ensuring that security measures don't create hostile conditions for students, Daniels had stated during staff meetings addressing increasing tensions. But the institutional culture at Lincoln prioritized administrative control over student welfare, security procedures often escalating rather than resolving conflicts between students and authority figures. Vice Principal Sandra Mitchell had been documenting concerning patterns in Hutchinson's behavior, while facing resistance from security personnel who claimed administrative oversight interfered with safety protocols. Hutchinson's interactions with minority students show consistent hostility that exceeds professional security procedures. Mitchell had noted in confidential reports that administration had not adequately addressed. The institutional tolerance for Hutchinson's abuse had created an environment where students, particularly minority youth, felt threatened rather than protected by security presence designed to ensure educational safety. Kennedy's morning had been routine, arriving early, organizing materials at her locker, preparing for first-period advanced placement English, where her quiet brilliance expressed itself through written analysis rather than class participation. Her best friend, Jasmine Porter, had been planning to meet Kennedy at their usual spot, their friendship spanning elementary school and characterized by complementary personalities. Jasmine's outgoing advocacy balancing Kennedy's thoughtful observation. What neither Kennedy nor her family could have anticipated was that Hutchinson's aggression would escalate from routine harassment of minority students to physical violence against honor student whose silence he would interpret as disrespect, requiring violent correction. Federal judicial protocols had prevented Judge Bennett from reviewing his phone during morning appellate arguments, creating communication delay that would make his eventual response more devastating than immediate emotional reaction. The legal framework protecting Kennedy would ultimately come from her father's judicial authority, but the initial assault would occur without the deterrent effect that knowledge of parental position might have provided. Department of Justice monitoring systems had been tracking patterns of abuse in school security nationwide, but individual cases hadn't yet triggered comprehensive intervention that Kennedy's assault would catalyze. Civil rights organizations had been documenting systematic violence against students by school resource officers, their advocacy preparing groundwork for federal accountability that specific triggering incident would activate. As Kennedy approached her locker in the quiet hallway before first period, she had no awareness that the next 3 minutes would transform her from anonymous student into catalyst for federal intervention, addressing systematic violence against youth in educational environments. The judge's daughter, who had been taught to respect authority and avoid confrontation, was about to experience the violence that her father's judicial career had been dedicated to preventing through constitutional enforcement and civil rights protection. Kennedy Bennett stood at her locker, organizing textbooks for her morning classes, her quiet presence in the hallway representing no threat or disruption to the learning environment that school security was supposedly protecting. The hallway was nearly empty. During the early morning period before most students arrived, Kennedy's habit of coming early, allowing her to avoid crowded corridors and prepare for classes without the social anxiety that large groups triggered. Officer Brad Hutchinson approached with aggressive posture that immediately created tension disproportionate to the benign situation of student organizing school materials at her assigned locker. "You need to move along," Hutchinson demanded, without greeting or explanation, his tone suggesting Kennedy's presence violated some unspecified rule despite her legitimate use of school facilities during regular hours. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Kennedy looked up with confused expression but remained silent, her natural conflict avoidance and respectful upbringing preventing verbal response to obviously unreasonable demand. Her silence, rather than de-escalating the situation, appeared to aggravate Hutchinson's hostility. "Did you hear me? I said move along. Students don't stand around in hallways during school hours." Kennedy's continued silence while she processed the illogical demand. She was at her locker during appropriate time for locker access was interpreted by Hutchinson as deliberate disrespect. "You think you can ignore me?" Hutchinson escalated, his voice rising with anger, disproportionate to the non-confrontational situation. "These kids think they can disrespect authority without consequences." Kennedy finally spoke with quiet politeness. "Officer Hutchinson, I'm just getting my books for class. I'm not doing anything wrong." Her reasonable explanation should have ended the encounter, but Hutchinson's reaction revealed that her calm response was perceived as challenge rather than compliance. "Don't talk back to me!" Hutchinson shouted while advancing aggressively. "You're showing exactly the kind of attitude that creates problems in this school." Teacher Angela Martinez, arriving early for class preparation, observed the interaction with growing concern. "Officer Hutchinson, Kennedy is honor student who's never had disciplinary issues. She's just using her locker appropriately." Hutchinson's response to teacher intervention revealed comprehensive hostility toward oversight. "Ms. Martinez, security decisions are my responsibility. Teachers don't determine appropriate enforcement procedures." Kennedy remained silent at her locker, her non-confrontational posture offering no justification for continued aggression. But Hutchinson interpreted her silence as defiance. "Close that locker and get to class immediately," Hutchinson commanded. Despite Kennedy needing to retrieve books for first period that hadn't yet begun, Kennedy quietly complied by closing her locker while still holding only one textbook. A cooperative response, demonstrating complete absence of disrespect or resistance that Hutchinson claimed to be addressing. Student Marcus Johnson, arriving early for student government meeting, began recording on his phone as he recognized escalating situation that appeared completely unjustified. "Officer Hutchinson is harassing Kennedy Bennett for no reason," Marcus whispered to his phone camera. "She's literally just standing at her locker, and he's acting like she's committing a crime." Hutchinson noticed the recording and escalated further. "Put that phone away immediately. Recording security officers is violation of school policy and constitutes interference with official duties." The false claim about recording policy while attempting to prevent documentation revealed consciousness of inappropriate behavior and desire to avoid accountability. Kennedy attempted to leave the situation by walking toward her classroom, her quiet compliance with the demand to move demonstrating complete absence of confrontational behavior. But as Kennedy walked away, Hutchinson kicked her hard in the back. The violent physical assault, completely unprovoked and shocking in its brutality against non-threatening student. Kennedy fell forward from the force, her textbook scattering across the floor while she caught herself against the wall. The physical assault witnessed by multiple students and staff who had been arriving for the school day. "That's what happens when you disrespect authority," Hutchinson stated while Kennedy struggled to process the shocking violence. "Maybe next time you'll show proper respect when security gives you instructions." Ms. Martinez rushed to Kennedy's aid while confronting Hutchinson. "You just assaulted a student." "Kennedy did nothing wrong, and you kicked her for no reason." Hutchinson's response revealed systematic abuse. Student was non-compliant and required physical intervention to establish security authority. "My actions were appropriate, given her disrespectful behavior." The characterization of silence and compliance as disrespectful behavior, requiring violent physical intervention, demonstrated exactly the abuse of authority that federal oversight was designed to prevent. Best friend Jasmine Porter arrived to witness Kennedy on the floor, her immediate horror transforming into protective advocacy. Officer Hutchinson just kicked Kennedy. She wasn't doing anything except standing at her locker. Multiple students were now recording the aftermath, while Kennedy remained on the floor, her shock and pain preventing immediate response to the completely unjustified violence. Marcus Johnson's video had captured the entire assault from approach through violent kick, providing irrefutable documentation that would prevent any attempt to falsify the circumstances or justify the attack. As Kennedy finally stood with assistance from Ms. Martinez and Jasmine, the physical pain was matched by emotional trauma of being violently attacked by authority figure in environment that should have provided safety and support for learning. The assault on Kennedy Bennett escalated beyond the initial violence as Officer Hutchinson attempted to justify his attack while preventing witnesses from documenting his misconduct or providing assistance to the injured student. Kennedy stood with visible back pain from where Hutchinson's boot had struck her, her quiet shock preventing verbal response, while witnesses provided advocacy. She was too traumatized to offer herself. "Kennedy needs medical attention immediately," Ms. Martinez insisted while supporting the injured student. "Officer Hutchinson, you just committed assault against a 15-year-old student who was completely non-threatening." Hutchinson's response revealed defensive aggression rather than accountability. The student was non-compliant and required physical intervention to establish respect for authority. Teachers don't determine appropriate security responses to disciplinary situations. The characterization of standing silently at a locker as non-compliance requiring violent physical intervention demonstrated systematic abuse of authority disguised as legitimate enforcement. Student body president Tyler Morrison arrived to witness the aftermath and immediately challenged Hutchinson's authority. "Officer Hutchinson, I watched what happened. Kennedy was just getting books from her locker, and you kicked her for no reason. That's assault, not security." Hutchinson's hostility towards student leadership revealed comprehensive disrespect. "Students don't determine security protocols. Your student government position doesn't grant authority over legitimate enforcement procedures." Multiple students had now gathered, their phones documenting both Kennedy's visible distress and Hutchinson's continuing aggression, rather than concern for the student he'd injured. Jasmine Porter attempted to escort Kennedy to the nurse's office. "Kennedy needs medical care. We're going to the nurse right now." Hutchinson blocked their path with threatening posture. "The student remains here until I complete my incident report." Witnesses don't remove subjects from security incidents without authorization. The prevention of medical care while treating assault victim as subject of investigation demonstrated systematic abuse extending beyond the initial violence. Vice Principal Sandra Mitchell, alerted by teacher, arrived to find Kennedy visibly injured while Hutchinson prevented assistance. "Officer Hutchinson, what happened here? Why is Kennedy hurt?" Hutchinson's explanation contradicted obvious evidence. Student was loitering in hallway, became verbally aggressive when instructed to move, and physically resisted security intervention requiring necessary force to establish control. Multiple witnesses immediately contradicted the false narrative. "That's completely untrue," Ms. Martinez stated. "Kennedy was silently using her locker when Officer Hutchinson harassed her without cause, then kicked her when she tried to leave." Tyler Morrison provided corroborating testimony. Vice Principal Mitchell We have multiple videos showing Kennedy did nothing wrong. Officer Hutchinson attacked her for no reason. Mitchell's response revealed administrative concern, but institutional hesitation. Officer Hutchinson, these are serious allegations. Kennedy is honor student with no disciplinary history. I'm going to need to review all video evidence before determining appropriate response. Hutchinson responded with territorial defensiveness. Vice Principal, security procedures are my jurisdiction. Administrative review of legitimate enforcement actions undermines security authority and creates dangerous precedent. Student-athlete Andre Williams, who had witnessed the assault, provided additional testimony. Vice Principal Mitchell, Kennedy is one of the quietest, most respectful students in school. Officer Hutchinson kicked her for literally nothing. This is abuse. The accumulating witness testimony from students, teacher, and video documentation created comprehensive evidence that administrative authority couldn't easily dismiss through institutional protection of security personnel. Kennedy finally found her, voice despite pain and trauma. Vice Principal Mitchell, I was just getting my books for class. I didn't do anything wrong. Officer Hutchinson kicked me in the back when I tried to walk away. Her quiet testimony carried authority that her usual silence had prevented. Her obvious pain and distress contradicting any suggestion of aggressive or threatening behavior. Counselor Jennifer Hayes arrived with medical training and immediately assessed Kennedy's condition. Kennedy requires immediate medical evaluation for back injury and potential trauma. She needs to go to the hospital, not remain here while security completes paperwork. Hutchinson's resistance to medical intervention revealed systematic cruelty. Medical care can be provided after incident documentation. Subject removal prevents thorough investigation of circumstances requiring force. Principal Daniels, finally, alerted to the situation, arrived to find Kennedy injured and surrounded by multiple witnesses documenting assault by school security officer. What is happening here? Daniels demanded, his administrative authority finally engaging with situation that had been escalating without adequate oversight. Hutchinson attempted to control the narrative. Principal Daniels, I responded to non-compliant student using appropriate security protocols. Administrative interference complicates legitimate enforcement and creates security vulnerabilities. But the combination of witness testimony, video documentation, and Kennedy's visible injury created evidence that administrative authority couldn't ignore through typical institutional protection of security personnel. Kennedy is going to receive immediate medical care, Daniels announced. Officer Hutchinson, you are suspended pending full investigation. This situation will be reviewed thoroughly with district administration and legal counsel. As Kennedy was finally escorted to receive medical attention, while multiple students shared videos across social media, the assault had been documented too comprehensively for typical institutional dismissal. But none of them yet knew that Kennedy's father possessed federal judicial authority that would transform school security abuse into federal case requiring comprehensive accountability beyond administrative discipline. While Officer Hutchinson's assault on Kennedy Bennett unfolded at Lincoln High School, multiple parallel developments were creating comprehensive federal response that would transform routine school violence into civil rights case, requiring judicial intervention at the USDA highest levels. Judge Isaiah Bennett was presiding over appellate arguments in federal courtroom, his judicial duties requiring complete focus on constitutional questions affecting multiple states, his phone silenced according to court protocols that prevented communication during proceedings. The federal appellate session involved civil rights case that ironically addressed excessive force by government officials, Bennett's judicial analysis emphasizing constitutional protections against violence by those wielding state authority. Government officials who abuse their authority violate the constitutional rights they are sworn to protect, Bennett stated during oral argument. Our precedent clearly establishes that excessive force against non-threatening individuals constitutes deprivation of rights under color of law. His judicial reasoning during that very session would soon apply to his own daughter's assault in ways that no one in the courtroom could have anticipated. Court Administrator Margaret Sullivan received emergency call from Dr. Nicole Bennett, who had been contacted by school administration about Kennedy's injury requiring hospital transport. Judge Bennett's daughter has been assaulted by school security officer, Sullivan reported to Chambers staff. We need to notify the judge immediately about family emergency requiring his attention. Federal judicial protocol allowed interruption for family emergencies, but timing meant Bennett wouldn't receive notification until after appellate session concluded. Dr. Bennett was racing from hospital to Lincoln High School after receiving call about Kennedy's injury, her medical training immediately recognizing that minor incident described by school administration likely understated actual violence. My daughter was kicked by school security officer, Dr. Bennett informed hospital emergency department. I'm bringing her for comprehensive medical evaluation and documentation of injuries for potential legal proceedings. Her physician expertise ensured that Kennedy's injuries would be thoroughly documented with medical authority that administrative minimization couldn't dismiss. Meanwhile, video of Hutchinson's assault had been shared across social media platforms, accumulating hundreds of thousands of views within the first hour, as students, parents, and community members expressed outrage. Student Marcus Johnson's video clearly showed Kennedy standing peacefully at her locker, Hutchinson's aggressive approach, Kennedy's quiet compliance, and the shocking violence of the kick that sent her sprawling. School security officer kicks honor student for no reason, viral posts declared. Kennedy Bennett was literally just standing at her locker. This is what black students face in schools every day. The social media amplification was creating public accountability that administrative procedures alone could never provide. Civil rights attorney Helen Foster, monitoring social media for patterns of abuse affecting youth, immediately recognized federal civil rights implications. School security assault on non-threatening student shows excessive force and potential racial discrimination requiring federal investigation. Her legal analysis was preparing community response that would complement federal judicial authority once Judge Bennett became aware of the assault. NAACP Representative Angela Brooks contacted community leaders about coordinating response to systematic school violence. Kennedy Bennett's assault represents broader pattern affecting minority students who face disproportionate violence from school security personnel. Community organizing was building pressure for accountability that administrative protection of security personnel historically prevented. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division monitored social media reports flagging potential federal violations. School security assault in Riverside shows excessive force against minor without apparent justification. This warrants preliminary federal inquiry. Federal monitoring systems were identifying the case as requiring potential civil rights investigation before Judge Bennett's personal involvement escalated institutional response. Congressional Representative Linda Brown, whose district included Lincoln High School, received constituent complaints demanding federal investigation. My constituents report systematic abuse by school security, particularly affecting minority students. Kennedy Bennett's assault requires federal civil rights investigation. Legislative pressure was adding political accountability beyond judicial or administrative mechanisms. Reporter James Parker began investigating for local news coverage, his journalism research revealing pattern of complaints about Hutchinson's behavior toward minority students. School security officer Brad Hutchinson has multiple complaints about excessive force, but administration has not taken meaningful disciplinary action. Media investigation was documenting systematic patterns that administrative tolerance had enabled. Federal judicial ethics protocols required that Judge Bennett recuse himself from any cases involving his daughter, but his judicial authority could still trigger federal prosecution mechanisms, even without personal involvement in adjudication. Chief Judge Victoria Lawrence received preliminary notification about potential federal case involving Circuit Judge Bennett's family member. Judge Bennett's daughter was assaulted by school security. This will require careful handling given judicial ethics and potential federal jurisdiction. Judicial administrative awareness ensured that federal response would be coordinated appropriately once Bennett learned of the assault. FBI Civil Rights Division maintained database of excessive force incidents involving minors, Kennedy's case, flagged for potential pattern investigation. School security violence against non-threatening students requires federal monitoring for systematic civil rights violations. As multiple accountability systems independently identified the assault as requiring federal attention, comprehensive response was developing that would converge once Judge Bennett's personal involvement escalated institutional priority. The convergence of judicial authority, federal prosecution, civil rights advocacy, community organizing, and media scrutiny ensured that Kennedy's assault would receive comprehensive accountability rather than administrative dismissal that had protected previous misconduct. Judge Isaiah Bennett concluded appellate arguments and immediately received emergency notification about Kennedy's assault, his judicial composure barely containing the fury of father learning his daughter had been violently attacked while under school's protective custody. "My daughter was assaulted by school security," Bennett stated with controlled intensity while coordinating with Chambers staff. "I want federal marshals, DOJ Civil Rights Division, and FBI notified immediately. This assault on my child constitutes federal civil rights violation requiring comprehensive prosecution." His judicial authority provided resources and institutional mechanisms that typical parents of abused students couldn't access through standard complaint procedures. Bennett watched Marcus Johnson's viral video showing Hutchinson kicking Kennedy, the images triggering both parental rage and judicial assessment of obvious constitutional violations requiring federal accountability. "That officer kicked my daughter without provocation or justification," Bennett stated to U.S. Marshal Rodriguez. "I want him arrested on federal civil rights charges immediately. My judicial position requires recusal from case adjudication, but it doesn't prevent me from initiating federal prosecution for assault on my child." Marshal Rodriguez coordinated immediate federal response. "Judge Bennett, we're mobilizing federal law enforcement response. Officer Hutchinson will be taken into federal custody, and DOJ is opening comprehensive civil rights investigation." The federal coordination ensured rapid institutional response that typical victims of school security violence rarely received. Dr. Bennett had transported Kennedy to hospital emergency department where comprehensive medical examination documented injuries. Kennedy has significant soft tissue damage, bruising, and back trauma requiring ongoing treatment. Medical documentation will support assault prosecution. The physician expertise ensured that Kennedy's injuries would be comprehensively documented with medical authority that administrative minimization couldn't dismiss. Federal Prosecutor Patricia Young reviewed video evidence and initiated criminal civil rights charges. Officer Hutchinson's assault shows willful deprivation of rights under color of law. Video documentation provides clear evidence for federal prosecution. DOJ Civil Rights Attorney Amanda Clark expanded investigation beyond individual assault to systematic patterns. Hutchinson's personnel file and community complaints suggest Systematic abuse requiring comprehensive federal investigation of school security practices. The institutional response ensured that accountability would address both individual violence and systematic problems enabling abuse. FBI agent Carlos Rivera arrived at Lincoln High School with federal authority demanding immediate access to all security footage, personnel files, and incident reports. FBI is conducting federal civil rights investigation. All evidence must be preserved and provided to federal authorities immediately. Principal Daniels recognized that federal intervention exceeded his administrative authority. Agent Rivera, we're fully cooperating with federal investigation. Officer Hutchinson has been suspended, and we're conducting internal review. Rivera's response was definitive. Principal Daniels, federal investigation supersedes internal review. This is criminal civil rights case requiring federal prosecution rather than administrative discipline. Judge Bennett arrived at Lincoln High School in the early afternoon, his federal judicial authority commanding immediate attention from school administration, unprepared for circuit court judge, demanding accountability for assault on his daughter. "I'm Judge Isaiah Bennett, U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals," he announced to assembled administrators. 2 hours ago, School Security Officer Brad Hutchinson violently assaulted my 15-year-old daughter Kennedy while she stood peacefully at her locker. The revelation of Kennedy's identity as federal judge's daughter transformed administrative response from routine incident management to recognition of comprehensive federal accountability. "Judge Bennett, we had no idea Kennedy was your daughter," Principal Daniels stammered. "If we had known," Bennett interrupted with judicial precision. "Principal Daniels, my daughter's identity is irrelevant to the fact that security officer under your supervision committed unprovoked assault against non-threatening student. Every child deserves protection from violence, regardless of parental position." His reframing challenged any suggestion that Kennedy deserved protection only because of judicial family connection rather than constitutional rights applicable to all students. Vice Principal Mitchell provided documentation of previous complaints about Hutchinson. "Judge Bennett, we have documented concerns about Officer Hutchinson's behavior toward minority students, but district administration has not authorized meaningful disciplinary action." Bennett's response was cutting. Vice Principal Mitchell, "Documented complaints without action constitute administrative enabling of systematic abuse. Federal investigation will examine why institutional tolerance allowed violent officer to continue threatening students." As federal marshals arrived to arrest Hutchinson, while FBI secured evidence and DOJ attorneys interviewed witnesses, the comprehensive federal response demonstrated institutional power that typical victims of school violence couldn't access. "Brad Hutchinson, you are under arrest for deprivation of rights under color of law, assault of a minor, and excessive force," Marshal Rodriguez announced, while placing Hutchinson in federal custody. Hutchinson's shock at federal arrest revealed expectation of administrative protection. "I was performing my security duties according to school protocols. Administrative review hasn't even been completed." Bennett confronted Hutchinson directly. "Officer Hutchinson, you kicked my 15-year-old daughter without provocation or justification. Your assault violated her constitutional rights and traumatized a child who should have been safe at school. Federal prosecution will ensure appropriate accountability." The direct confrontation between federal judge and officer who had assaulted his daughter created moment of unavoidable accountability that administrative procedures alone would never have provided. Lincoln High School became the focal point of federal intervention as Judge Isaiah Bennett's judicial authority combined with comprehensive video evidence to expose Officer Hutchinson's assault as symptom of systematic violence requiring institutional accountability beyond individual prosecution. The transformation from routine school incident to federal case occurred with precision, that reflected Bennett's 2 decades of legal experience applied to protecting his traumatized daughter and preventing future violence against vulnerable students. Officer Brad Hutchinson, Judge Bennett stated with controlled judicial authority before assembled school administration, federal agents, and media who had rapidly gathered, "You violently assaulted my daughter Kennedy while she stood peacefully at her locker engaged in routine school activities." Hutchinson stood in federal custody, his confident security authority completely dismantled by recognition that his victim's father possessed federal judicial power and institutional resources far exceeding typical parents of abused students. "Judge Bennett, I had no knowledge of Kennedy's family background," Hutchinson attempted to explain. "If I had known she was your daughter, I would never have—" Bennett interrupted with devastating precision. "Officer Hutchinson, that statement reveals exactly the problem. My daughter deserved protection from violence regardless of her parentage. Every student has constitutional rights that you violated through unprovoked assault." The judicial reframing challenged any suggestion that Kennedy's protection derived from family connection rather than constitutional rights applicable to all children. Principal Daniels attempted institutional damage control. "Judge Bennett, I want to assure you that Officer Hutchinson's behavior does not reflect our school's values or commitment to student safety." Bennett's response exposed systematic failure. Principal Daniels, Vice Principal Mitchell provided documentation showing years of complaints about Officer Hutchinson's violence toward minority students without meaningful intervention. This represents institutional enabling rather than isolated incident. The citation of administrative tolerance elevated accountability beyond individual officer to systematic practices that had allowed abuse to continue. Federal Prosecutor Young announced comprehensive charges before gathered witnesses. Brad Hutchinson faces federal charges for deprivation of rights under color of law, assault of a minor, excessive force, and false reporting. Video evidence and witness testimony provide clear documentation of constitutional violations. The federal criminal prosecution ensured accountability beyond administrative discipline that had historically protected abusive security personnel. DOJ Civil Rights Attorney Clark expanded investigation scope. FBI is conducting comprehensive civil rights investigation into systematic patterns of excessive force by school security personnel, particularly affecting minority students who have filed complaints without adequate administrative response. The institutional investigation transformed Kennedy's individual assault into examination of systematic practices requiring comprehensive reform. Student witnesses provided testimony documenting Hutchinson's pattern of targeting minority students. Tyler Morrison, Jasmine Porter, and Andre Williams all described previous incidents where Hutchinson had used excessive force or discriminatory treatment. Officer Hutchinson consistently treats Black and Latino students more aggressively than white students, Tyler testified. Kennedy's assault was shocking, but it represents a pattern we've been experiencing without adequate administrative protection. Community testimony connected individual case to systematic discrimination requiring federal civil rights intervention. Teacher Angela Martinez provided educator perspective. "I've witnessed Officer Hutchinson's aggressive behavior toward minority students for years and filed complaints that administration dismissed as personality conflicts rather than recognizing systematic bias." The faculty corroboration demonstrated that administrative awareness had not produced adequate intervention to prevent violence. Civil rights attorney Foster announced federal civil rights lawsuit. The Bennett family is filing comprehensive federal litigation against Officer Hutchinson, Lincoln High School, and Riverside School District for constitutional violations, inadequate supervision, and systematic tolerance of discriminatory violence. The civil liability created financial consequences beyond criminal prosecution that would motivate institutional reform. Media coverage had reached national scale, with headlines emphasizing both individual violence and systematic problems. Federal judge's daughter kicked by school officer. Video exposes systematic abuse of minority students. The publicity created accountability that administrative procedures alone could never provide. Kennedy, though traumatized, provided victim testimony with quiet dignity that reflected her character. Officer Hutchinson kicked me for no reason. I was just getting books for class. I don't understand why he hurt me. Her simple testimony carried moral authority that complicated legal arguments couldn't match. Dr. Bennett provided medical documentation. Kennedy has significant injuries requiring ongoing treatment. Beyond physical trauma, she's experiencing emotional distress from being violently attacked by authority figure in an environment that should have provided safety. The physician expertise ensured that Kennedy's suffering would be comprehensively documented for both criminal and civil proceedings. Superintendent Michael Harrison, recognizing federal crisis, announced immediate district-wide policy changes. We're suspending all school resource officer programs pending comprehensive review of security practices and implementation of federal civil rights compliance protocols. The institutional response demonstrated that federal intervention could catalyze immediate policy transformation that years of community complaints had not produced. As Hutchinson was transported to federal detention while FBI investigators secured evidence and DOJ attorneys interviewed witnesses, the power shift was complete. The school security officer who had confidently kicked a silent teenager expecting administrative protection now faced federal prosecution that would ensure criminal accountability. Most importantly, systematic investigation would address institutional practices that had enabled years of violence against minority students whose complaints had been dismissed without adequate administrative response. Judge Bennett's judicial authority had transformed his daughter's assault from potential administrative dismissal into comprehensive federal accountability that would protect future students from violence that should never occur in educational environments. Within 72 hours of Officer Hutchinson's assault on Kennedy Bennett, comprehensive federal intervention transformed school security violence from administratively tolerated practice into criminal prosecution and systematic reform, addressing institutional failures that had endangered students. Department of Justice announced federal prosecution with unusual public specificity. Brad Hutchinson faces federal charges for deprivation of rights under color of law, assault of a minor causing bodily injury, and false official reporting. Video evidence provides clear documentation of unprovoked violence against non-threatening student. The federal criminal case ensured accountability beyond administrative discipline that had historically protected abusive security personnel from meaningful consequences. Hutchinson was denied bail due to flight risk and danger to community, federal detention, ensuring he couldn't continue threatening students while awaiting trial. Defendant's assault on vulnerable minor while in position of authority demonstrates danger requiring pre-trial detention. The detention decision reflected judicial recognition of serious threat posed by security personnel who violently abused their authority over children. FBI's expanded investigation documented systematic civil rights violations at Lincoln High. School security records show patterns of excessive force complaints disproportionately affecting minority students, with inadequate administrative response creating hostile educational environment. The institutional investigation ensured reform would address systematic problems rather than treating Hutchinson as isolated individual whose removal would solve deeper cultural issues. Principal Daniels and Vice Principal Mitchell were placed. on administrative leave pending investigation of their role in enabling Hutchinson's abuse through inadequate supervision and failure to address documented complaints. Administrative leadership that tolerates systematic violence against students represents fundamental failure requiring accountability beyond officer prosecution. Federal investigators determined the leadership consequences demonstrated that enabling abuse through inadequate oversight carried professional repercussions for supervisory personnel. Riverside School District was placed under federal consent decree requiring comprehensive reform, independent oversight of security personnel, mandatory bias training, revised use of force policies prohibiting violence against non-threatening students, and community accountability mechanisms. Federal oversight will continue until district demonstrates sustainable constitutional compliance protecting students' civil rights, DOJ announced. Lincoln High School's entire school resource officer program was suspended and replaced with alternative safety approaches, emphasizing counseling, de-escalation, and community partnership rather than law enforcement presence. School safety should be achieved through supportive relationships rather than aggressive enforcement that creates fear and trauma, reformed policies emphasized. Kennedy received comprehensive medical and psychological care for physical injuries and emotional trauma. Kennedy is experiencing PTSD symptoms from being violently attacked by authority figure. Recovery requires ongoing therapeutic support. Dr. Bennett's medical expertise ensured Kennedy received appropriate care while documenting long-term impact that single violent incident created for traumatized teenager. Judge Bennett, despite his judicial position, addressed community meeting about Kennedy's assault and systematic reform. My daughter received federal protection because of my position, but every child deserves equal safety regardless of parental status. Systematic reform must protect all students, not just those with powerful families. His advocacy emphasized that reform must serve universal protection rather than privileged access to justice. Civil rights settlement included $8.5 million compensatory damages plus agreement for comprehensive school security reform and student rights training. Financial compensation addresses Kennedy's suffering, but systematic reform prevents future violence. Student advocacy groups formed oversight committees, ensuring that administrative promises of reform translated into sustained cultural change. Student voice in security policy ensures that safety measures protect rather than threaten those they're designed to serve. Tyler Morrison led student government efforts. Kennedy's assault showed us that waiting for adults to protect us isn't enough. We need student power in creating safe schools. Federal trial resulted in Hutchinson's conviction on all charges. And 15-year federal prison sentence. Brad Hutchinson's assault on Kennedy Bennett was unprovoked violence against vulnerable child in his care. His abuse of authority requires substantial punishment that deters similar misconduct. The significant federal sentence demonstrated that violence against children by authority figures carried serious criminal consequences when cases received appropriate federal prosecution. Teacher training was comprehensively revised to emphasize recognizing and reporting security misconduct. Educators must prioritize student safety over administrative loyalty when security personnel abuse their authority. Community oversight. Board with independent investigation authority was established, including student representatives. Student participation in accountability ensures that safety policies serve rather than threaten those most affected. National education organizations adopted Kennedy Bennett protocols for school security oversight, mandatory video documentation, independent complaint investigation, prohibition on force against non-threatening students, and student rights education. 1 year after the assault, Data showed measurable transformation. Security violence incidents at Lincoln decreased 92%. Student trust improved significantly, and academic outcomes increased as hostile security environment was replaced by supportive educational culture. Students learn better when they feel safe rather than threatened, educational research confirmed. Kennedy's recovery included returning to Lincoln High School, where she became advocate for student rights. My assault was terrifying, but seeing systematic change helps me heal. No student should experience violence at school. Her transformation from victim to advocate demonstrated resilience while acknowledging ongoing trauma requiring continued support. The accountability process proved that comprehensive response to school violence required criminal prosecution, civil liability, administrative reform, community oversight, and sustained federal monitoring to transform culture enabling abuse. Over the following 36 months, the transformation catalyzed by Kennedy Bennett's assault evolved from Lincoln High School-specific reforms into national movement, addressing systematic school security violence that had affected students, while institutional tolerance prevented adequate accountability. The Student Safety and Civil Rights Act, inspired partly by Kennedy's case, established federal standards prohibiting excessive force in schools, mandatory training for security personnel, independent investigation of abuse complaints, and federal prosecution authority for systematic violations. The Bennett case demonstrated need for federal standards preventing local administrative protection of violent security personnel. Congressional Representative Brown explained during legislative debate. The legislative framework ensured federal resources would support systematic reform rather than relying on local accountability that had historically failed to protect students. Judge Bennett became prominent judicial voice for youth civil rights while maintaining his appellate duties. Children in educational environments deserve constitutional protection from violence by those entrusted with their safety. Federal enforcement must prioritize the most vulnerable. His judicial credibility provided authoritative voice that complemented student advocacy and community organizing demanding systematic change. The Kennedy Bennett Foundation, established with civil rights settlement funds, supported families affected by school security violence while funding legal representation, trauma counseling, and advocacy resources that individual victims typically couldn't access. Kennedy received federal protection because of my judicial position, Judge Bennett acknowledged during foundation launch. This organization ensures other families receive similar support regardless of their circumstances or connections. School districts nationwide implemented Bennett protocols for security personnel oversight, mandatory body cameras with automatic activation, independent civilian review boards with student representation, prohibition on physical force against non-threatening students, and trauma-informed approaches to school safety. Kennedy Bennett was kicked for standing silently at her locker, protocol documentation stated. Security measures must protect rather than threaten students engaged in routine educational activities. Cultural competency training, addressing implicit bias became mandatory for all school security personnel, with independent evaluation ensuring meaningful engagement rather than procedural compliance that had characterized previous ineffective programs. Previous training was checkbox exercise that didn't change behavior, reformed programs acknowledged. Effective bias training requires sustained commitment to examining how prejudice affects interactions with minority youth. Student rights. Education became standard curriculum component, ensuring young people understood constitutional protections and appropriate response to authority figure misconduct. Students who know their rights can better protect themselves and document abuse, requiring accountability. Kennedy became national youth advocate, speaking at schools, conferences, and congressional hearings about student rights and security reform. I was silent at my locker when Officer Hutchinson kicked me. My silence wasn't disrespect, it was my personality. Students shouldn't face violence for being quiet or different. Her advocacy emphasized that school safety must accommodate diverse student personalities rather than demanding conformity through fear and intimidation. Community-based school safety models replaced law enforcement presence in hundreds of schools. Counselors, social workers, restorative justice coordinators, and mental health professionals provided support addressing underlying issues rather than punitive enforcement creating hostile environments. Many situations in schools don't require security response, educators explained. Trained professionals can address conflicts, mental health crises, and student needs without violence or criminalization. Independent investigation of security misconduct became standard through civilian oversight boards with subpoena power and disciplinary authority separate from school administration. Administrative investigation of security personnel creates conflict of interest. Independent civilian oversight ensures accountability. Federal pattern and practice investigations expanded to proactively examine school security practices before individual cases reached crisis. Early intervention prevents violence rather than merely responding after students are harmed. Dr. Bennett's medical research documented long-term trauma effects of school security violence. Students who experience violence from authority figures suffer PTSD, academic decline, and lasting distrust of institutions. Prevention serves both individual well-being and educational outcomes. National database tracking security personnel misconduct prevented problem officers from moving between districts after termination. Comprehensive tracking prevents violent security officers from finding new positions where abuse patterns continue. Use of force reporting requirements with public transparency allowed community monitoring of security practices. Transparency enables oversight identifying problematic patterns before they escalate to serious violence. Legal reforms eliminated qualified immunity for school security personnel, ensuring civil liability for constitutional violations. Security officers must face personal consequences for abusing authority over vulnerable children in their care. Restorative justice programs addressing community harm from security violence provided healing processes beyond individual prosecution. School violence traumatizes entire communities. Healing requires acknowledging collective harm and providing comprehensive support. Academic research validated student experiences previously dismissed as complaints. Data confirms systematic patterns of excessive force disproportionately affecting minority students. Statistical analysis provides evidence-based supporting comprehensive reform. 3 years after the assault, comprehensive data demonstrated measurable transformation. School security violence incidents decreased 74% nationally, student well-being indicators improved significantly, and academic outcomes increased as hostile security environments were replaced by supportive educational cultures. Reform serves both student safety and educational mission, analysis concluded. Students learn better when schools protect rather than threaten them. International education organizations recognized American school security reform as model, addressing problems many nations faced. The Bennett case catalyzed transformation, showing that student safety and civil rights aren't competing values. Kennedy's personal recovery included academic success despite trauma, her resilience inspiring others while acknowledging ongoing healing. I still have anxiety sometimes at school, but seeing systematic change helps me understand my assault created something positive. No student should experience what I did. Judge Bennett continued balancing judicial duties with reform advocacy. Protecting children from violence by authority figures represents fundamental constitutional obligation. Federal enforcement must prioritize the most vulnerable members of society. The systematic reforms ensured that Kennedy Bennett's assault catalyzed transformation, protecting countless future students from violence that institutional tolerance had normalized through inadequate accountability and administrative protection of abusive security personnel. The transformation from individual assault to national reform movement demonstrated that comprehensive change required criminal prosecution, civil liability, legislative action, community oversight, student empowerment, and sustained federal monitoring operating simultaneously to transform educational culture. 4 years after Officer Brad Hutchinson kicked Kennedy Bennett in a school hallway, father and daughter stood together at the National Student Rights Conference, representing the personal and systematic transformation that had emerged from violence that could have been administratively dismissed. Kennedy, now 19, and college freshman studying education policy, had transformed from traumatized victim to powerful advocate whose testimony combined personal experience with policy expertise. 4 years ago, I was kicked by school security officer for standing silently at my locker. That violence taught me that students need protection from those supposed to keep them safe. Her evolution from silent honor student to confident public speaker demonstrated both resilience and ongoing commitment to ensuring other students received protection she had been denied. Judge Isaiah Bennett, whose judicial career continued alongside reform advocacy, reflected on the transformation violence had catalyzed. As federal judge, I've spent my career interpreting constitutional protections. Kennedy's assault made those abstract principles devastatingly personal, while demonstrating that justice requires both legal authority and sustained advocacy. His perspective acknowledged that judicial position had enabled Kennedy's justice while emphasizing that systematic reform must provide equal protection regardless of family, circumstances. Statistical evidence demonstrated measurable national impact. School security violence incidents had decreased 68%. Student civil rights complaints about security personnel had dropped 71%, and educational outcomes had improved as hostile enforcement environments were replaced by supportive school cultures. Numbers represent individual students. Protected and educational environments transformed, researchers documented. But sustained change requires ongoing commitment beyond initial reform enthusiasm. Brad Hutchinson remained in federal prison, serving his 15-year sentence. His case establishing precedent that violence against students by security personnel carried serious federal criminal consequences. School security officers who abuse authority over vulnerable children face substantial federal punishment. Lincoln High School had been transformed under federal oversight. Its culture shift from punitive enforcement to restorative support, serving as national model. We've rebuilt trust through transparency, student voice in safety policies, and commitment to protection rather than control. Principal Daniels had been replaced by reform-minded leadership, prioritizing student well-being. Education requires safe environments where students feel protected rather than threatened by those entrusted with their care. Student oversight committees with meaningful authority ensured sustained reform. Tyler Morrison, who had witnessed Kennedy's assault, now served on District Safety Board. Student power and security policy ensures practices serve, rather than threaten those they're designed to protect. The Kennedy Bennett Foundation had supported 5,000 families affected by school security violence, providing resources that individual victims typically couldn't access. Foundation ensures that protection Kennedy received becomes available to every student, regardless of circumstances. Dr. Bennett's medical research on trauma from institutional violence had influenced national education policy. School violence by authority figures creates lasting harm, affecting academic achievement, mental health, and institutional trust. Prevention serves both individual well-being and educational mission. Community-based safety models had replaced law enforcement presence in 2,000 schools nationwide. Many student needs don't require security response. Trained counselors and social workers address underlying issues without violence or criminalization. Federal legislation bearing Kennedy's name. The Kennedy-Bennett Student Safety Act established national standards, ensuring local administrative failures couldn't prevent accountability. Federal framework guarantees justice, doesn't depend on parental position or local political will. International education organizations recognized American reform, progress while acknowledging ongoing challenges. The Bennett case catalyzed significant transformation, but sustained commitment requires addressing structural inequality extending beyond school security to systemic racism, affecting educational access. Kennedy's relationship with her father had deepened through shared advocacy. Dad's judicial authority gave me justice. But our partnership in reform work gave my assault meaning beyond personal trauma. We're protecting students who don't have federal judges as parents. Judge Bennett's pride in his daughter's transformation was evident. Kennedy could have let trauma define her. Instead, she became voice for students who face violence without resources for accountability. Her courage inspires my continued commitment to civil rights enforcement. As father and daughter concluded their conference presentation to sustained applause, the transformation was complete. Violence that could have been dismissed through administrative protection had catalyzed national reform movement addressing systematic problems affecting millions of students. Kennedy's message to the audience emphasized both progress and ongoing work. My assault received justice because my father is federal judge. True accountability means every student receives equal protection, regardless of who their parents are or what positions they hold. Judge Bennett added judicial perspective. Constitutional protections mean nothing if we don't enforce them for the most vulnerable. Student safety requires both legal standards and sustained advocacy, ensuring schools protect rather than harm those in their care. The standing ovation acknowledged not just their personal journey, but the cultural transformation their advocacy had catalyzed, and the thousands of students whose safety had been enhanced through systematic reform. Most importantly, their story demonstrated that justice required both individual courage and institutional accountability, that personal trauma could catalyze collective healing, and that protecting constitutional rights meant confronting authority figures who violated rather than defended the principles they were sworn to uphold. The silent teenager who had been kicked for standing at her locker and the federal judge who had demanded comprehensive accountability had together transformed American education culture, proving that systematic reform could emerge from individual violence when legal authority, community advocacy, and sustained commitment converged to protect the most vulnerable members of society. Their legacy would be measured not in legal precedents or policy changes alone, but in the countless students who would attend schools where safety meant protection rather than control, where authority figures served rather than threatened, and where every child's constitutional rights were defended regardless of their parents' positions or their own ability to advocate for themselves. That transformation from individual assault to national movement, from administrative dismissal to federal accountability, from institutional violence to systematic protection, represented the kind of change that made both individual schools and entire educational systems more just, more safe, and more faithful to constitutional principles, requiring equal protection for all students under the care of institutions entrusted with their well-being and their futures. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.